Some of the most powerful stories I've ever experienced weren't read or watched, they were played. And over the past decade, I've dedicated this channel to exploring what video games are uniquely capable of as a storytelling medium. In that time, I've analyzed hundreds of games, and time again, I've seen this medium confront questions and convey ideas that other forms of storytelling could only gesture toward. Today, I want to rank what I personally feel are the very best that the medium has to offer. Before I jump straight into things, I want to quickly outline the criteria behind this list. There are the usual elements of great storytelling that were considered: engaging character arcs, pacing, emotional impact, dialogue, as well as symbolic and philosophical depth. How complex the narrative manages to be while also keeping the audience's engagement is a factor. But then there are factors unique to video games: how well the story balances against gameplay, how deeply the storytelling is integrated into the gameplay itself, and what about the story could only be told in interactive form. And finally, I will note that there is no more than one game from a franchise on the list of 20. If that weren't the case, well, y'all would know that this list would just be Metal Gear and Legacy of Kain, let's be real. Of course, there are countless games that fit all these criteria, and narrowing them down to a list of 20 was no easy feat. So before we transition into the top 20, I need to acknowledge 12 honorable mentions, in no particular order. Shadow of the Colossus, for bringing minimalist storytelling into the mainstream while still feeling utterly epic. Dark Souls, for refining environmental storytelling to a state of such perfection that hundreds of other games are indebted to it. Portal 2, for delivering some of the sharpest comedic writing in gaming while never letting it detract from its apocalyptic atmosphere. Metal Gear Solid 3 Snake Eater, for marrying pulpy Cold War spectacle with one of the most heartbreaking tales of sacrifice that you will ever hear. Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice, for evoking the realities of psychosis in a way that only an interactive medium could. Mass Effect 2, for crafting one of the strongest ensemble casts in gaming and perfecting the character-driven loyalty mission structure. Red Dead Redemption 2, for delivering one of the most meticulously crafted and emotionally resonant character studies in Arthur Morgan. The Walking Dead Season 1, for telling a devastating story about responsibility and sacrifice through player-driven choice. What Remains of Edith Finch, for using shifting gameplay styles to embody memory and family tragedy in a way that only an interactive medium could. Killer 7, for its avant-garde take on global politics and its rebellious sense of style. Baldur's Gate 3, for constructing what I believe is the most intricate and reactive narrative ever realized in a video game. And finally, Clair Obscur Expedition 33, for building a world destined to die and exploring what it means to create meaning when time itself is running out. With all that said, we can finally turn to the 20 that, in my view, stand above the rest. These are the top 20 greatest video game stories. And in case you're wondering, this video contains no story spoilers for any of the games discussed, so you can watch safely. Number 20. Lost Odyssey. One would think that the most inappropriate thing you could do in a video game is make your main character immortal. If you did that, where would the challenge be? What are the stakes? What would make that character compelling if their life can't be threatened? Instead of seeing this as a massive limitation, the developers at Mistwalker Studios treated it as an opportunity. They built the entire story of Lost Odyssey around an immortal protagonist named Kaim, and instead of making death his ultimate fail state, they replaced it with the burden of 1,000 years of memory. And then the game did something even riskier. At multiple points throughout Lost Odyssey, Kaim will regain memories that he lost from the past millennia. When this happens, the player will be asked to read a short story, each one exploring what it means to remember centuries of love, loss, and regret. Once again, reading long stretches of text intermittently sounds like the kind of idea that would kill a game. But not only does it somehow work, it is one of the boldest, most unique forms of storytelling that I've seen from the medium. It helps when the man who wrote these short stories is one of the greatest authors in Japan, and they are all written with a concise form of prose that is reminiscent of Ernest Hemingway. By meditating on mortality for 60 hours of gameplay, Lost Odyssey did more to alleviate my fear of death than any other work of art I've experienced. It made me see death as a perfectly natural part of life that shouldn't be feared. And to this day, I credit Lost Odyssey for giving me a deeper appreciation for the fragile moments that make life beautiful. Number 19. Elden Ring. Ever since Demon's Souls in 2009, the developers over at From Software have meticulously tried to perfect their storytelling formula. Though all the stories they produced since then have been excellent, I firmly believe the greatest expression of their formula can be found in Elden Ring. While I don't believe it is overall as cohesive or thematically resonant as Dark Souls, it nonetheless comes close while simultaneously crafting a complex network of character arcs and political drama. What makes this achievement all the more remarkable, though, is how little of it is presented to the player directly. Where similar stories would take multiple hours of lore dumps and cutscenes to set up these storylines, most of it is relegated to the background for the player to discover for themselves, via item descriptions, environmental clues, and obscure NPC dialogue. The result is a story that fans have been obsessed with trying to piece together for the past 4 years. And just like with its predecessors, this is a practice that will be embraced for decades. At its core, Elden Ring is a story about the collapse of order, not just the order imposed by mortals through their governments, but also the very structure of reality itself. In the face of that decay, the player must decide whether a lasting order can be imposed on an impermanent world, and whether a single mortal can meaningfully alter its fate. It's a familiar archetype in Japanese storytelling, the lone figure standing against cosmic threats, but Elden Ring is arguably gaming's most ambitious expression of it. Number 18. Pathologic 2. Set in a dying town ravaged by plague, you play a doctor racing against time to save as many people as possible before the inevitable collapse. From the beginning, the game makes one thing painfully clear: you will not save everyone. Every day is a brutal exercise in triage. Who gets medicine? Where do you get that medicine from, and who can you give it to before people start to die? Where most games empower the player with better weapons, resources, and the illusion of control, Pathologic 2 strips all of that away. And in doing so, the player is forced to confront how firm their moral principles truly are when both their life and other people's lives are in their hands. What elevates the experience beyond its famous, or some might say infamous, difficulty is the writing quality. The game is staged somewhat like a theater play. Characters speak in riddles, metaphors, and philosophical fragments. It's almost like the town is consistently performing for you, and in recognizing this, you feel like your efforts to save lives are constantly being mocked. Simultaneously, while this plague narrative is happening, there is this very strange mythology that is deeply rooted in the history of southeastern Europe and Siberia. And at the heart of it is this idea that the town you're walking through is a living organism. This in turn makes the plague not only physical, but metaphysical, and contending with it on both those planes makes the game feel both metaphorically and literally transcendent. Taken collectively, Pathologic 2 ends up being one of the most uncompromising visions in the gaming medium, one that is as terrifying as it is bizarrely beautiful, and it will leave its scar long after the suffering subsides. Number 17. Spec-Ops: The Line. This game might be responsible for launching more video essays than any other video game ever made, which is appropriate given that the book it is based on, Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, has fueled hundreds of thousands of academic essays for over a century. As a literary adaptation, Spec-Ops: The Line modernizes the descent into madness illustrated in Conrad's book, except instead of a journey into the heart of colonial Africa to find a madman, it's a soldier journeying into a half-buried Dubai in search of a rogue colonel. But what Spec-Ops accomplishes is collapsing the distance between observer and participant. You aren't merely witnessing the savagery of man like Marlowe did in Heart of Darkness, you are Captain Walker, and you are playing an active role in birthing the horror that is consuming not just the landscape, but your very mind. Most shooter games condition gamers to play mindlessly. Enemies appear, and you are rewarded for killing them with efficiency. Spec-Ops weaponizes that conditioning against you. It lures you in with that familiar structure, only to slowly erode the certainty you once had that what you're doing is justified. And then, after one of the greatest and most devastating endings in video game history, it becomes impossible to fire a gun in any other game without at least a moment of hesitation. Few games leave that kind of psychological imprint on their players, and that is precisely why this game still matters. Number 16. Terranigma. There are few works of art that have made me feel as grateful to be alive as Terranigma. That is a remarkable accomplishment for a game that was released in the Super Nintendo era, a time when games were often dismissed as lesser art, if they were considered art at all. The game is one long meditation on the miracle of existence. You play a character named Ark, who is responsible for birthing the world, the continents, and all the life on them, and then seeing them cultivate to the present day. Instead of describing these events through lengthy exposition, they often unfold without a single word spoken, leaving both Ark and the player to engage in quiet reflection over their meaning. The most important question that the game subtly poses during these quiet moments is what your purpose is. What part do you play in the story of existence? What is the best way to act? In the game, you typically act believing that what you are doing is right, only to discover consequences you never anticipated. And sometimes, something unconscionably bad seems like it is about to happen, only for unforeseen benefits to emerge. It is then up to you to sit with those outcomes and learn how to act more wisely. It is a deep philosophical process, and yet, Terranigma never loses its sense of joy. It is saturated with the light-hearted silliness that made classic games so fun in the first place. Terranigma is a wholehearted embrace of life for all its beauty and its faults, and it holds up over 3 decades later. Number 15. The Witcher 3: Wild Hunt. While The Witcher 3's central narrative is solid, featuring unforgettable arcs like the tragic tale of the Bloody Baron and the Faustian bargain of Gaunter O'Dim, it is in its side quests that the game distinguishes itself from every other RPG ever made. Where so many other open-world games have side quests that feel like mindless busy work meant to help upgrade your stats, virtually all the side quests in The Witcher 3 feel like carefully constructed short stories, often forcing you to live with uncomfortable consequences. Much of that strength comes from the writing itself. Aside from a couple of other games on this list, I've never come across dialogue that is as sharp, restrained, and, most importantly, human. The characters you encounter feel less like quest givers, and more like actual people whose lives are quietly unraveling, and you have to be very careful not to make things worse, which, despite your best intentions, you almost certainly will. And often, the consequences of your decisions don't reveal themselves until hours later, sometimes quietly, sometimes brutally. It's a wonderful tribute to classic Slavic folklore, where monsters aren't always monsters, humans are often worse, and Geralt, caught between those two worlds, must decide the best way to act. Number 14. The Last of Us. This is arguably the most recognized game on this list. It not only helped shape the direction of AAA game development for the next decade and a half, with its cinematic presentation and technical polish, it also broke beyond the boundaries of the medium and had massive success with its television adaptation. But what is it about the original story that made it resonate at such a level? If I had to summarize it in a word, it would be discipline. By that, I mean the game refuses to sprawl beyond what it needs to say. It narrows its focus to 2 people trying to survive the apocalypse, and then does everything it can to make the bond they form feel as natural as possible. The affection between the characters of Joel and Ellie is built slowly and imperceptibly, through shared trauma and occasional humor rather than dramatic declarations. And it's in that slow transformation that the story finds its universality, because few bonds are as widely understood as that between a parent and a child. And there are few things that one wouldn't do to protect the other, even in the apocalypse. But once that attachment has taken root, the story refuses to protect either the characters or the player from the cruel choices that life often forces. In the game's final moments, a decision is made that is loving yet selfish, understandable yet indefensible all at once. But most importantly, it is disturbingly relatable. It reflects a darkness within us that we would rather not confront. The possibility that, if pushed far enough, we would sacrifice everything for the people who we love. And rather than resolve that possibility, it had the discipline to let the audience linger with it. That is what gives The Last of Us its lasting power. Number 13. SOMA. A common theme that you will see throughout the games on this list is existential philosophy, just like with my channel, but none of them embody existential horror quite like SOMA does. The game is built around a deceptively simple premise. What if your mind could be copied? Once this question is posed at the beginning of the game, its implications slowly unfold. Which version is really you? When that copy is made, do you become the copy? And what implications does this have for those who believe in the soul as a gift from God? The game's oppressive atmosphere, suffocating level design, monsters, and jump scares certainly contribute to the dread, but it is these philosophical questions that, at all times, serve as SOMA's primary source of horror. And because SOMA is a game rather than a novel, the burden of those questions does not remain theoretical. You are asked to make decisions that directly affect what becomes of other people's minds. At no point does the game cheat its own premise. Once the rules of consciousness are established, you follow them all the way up to one of the bleakest endings in video game history. One that will leave you questioning whether the consciousness, the self you cling to, is anything more than a comforting illusion. Number 12. Disco Elysium. Few games have placed as much faith in the written word as Disco Elysium. This game features no combat encounters, no bombastic action sequences. Your primary weapon is conversation, and you have to learn to utilize it best, not just with others, but with yourself. Disco Elysium starts with a man waking up at the lowest point of his life. His mind has been so obliterated by drugs and alcohol that he can't even remember his own name. All he can gather when he wakes up is that he is a detective who was tasked with solving a murder. The only thing that might be more tragic than his circumstance is the city he is working in, one that is burdened by failed revolutions and economic collapse. As you make your way through the city, your investigation brings you into contact with various political factions, each of which desire to mold the city of Revachol in their image. Everything from communism, fascism, to liberal moralism and centrism. Through these interactions, you follow the normal CRPG rules of dialogue checks and dice rolls. But where Disco Elysium stands out is in how it treats your inevitable failure. In most RPGs, a bad dialogue choice or dice roll halts progress. Here, the embarrassment and confusion that comes from failure are not obstacles to the narrative, rather they are the narrative. They are the moments that allow both the character and the player to assemble a coherent sense of self. It's in these moments of failure that Disco Elysium distinguishes itself as a darkly comic masterpiece, one that can make light of even the greatest of life's tragedies and, simultaneously, show that life is not only worth living, but that beneath the ruins of ideology and civilization, something transcendent might still endure, and perhaps we owe it to ourselves to witness that miracle. Number 11. Final Fantasy Tactics. In your typical Final Fantasy game, you gather a cast of lovable characters to go kill a tyrannical god. Out of all the iterations of this timeless formula, the story of Final Fantasy Tactics rises above the rest for multiple reasons. First, the game's script has a level of brevity and precision that would impress Shakespeare. And I'm not even exaggerating. Speaking of Shakespeare, if you play the War of the Lions version, or the most recent Evil East Chronicles version, the script is written with the old-school literary flair and cadence of Shakespeare. Some of the villains literally speak in iambic pentameter, which is awesome. Best of all, though, is that the dialogue never becomes impenetrable. It preserves the beauty and gravity of Shakespearean language without alienating the player. On top of this, the story manages to have the most complex interweaving of political struggle with religious allegory of any game in the series, while somehow managing to keep things comprehensible. There's a reason why the game is often compared to Game of Thrones, and it's not because of its medieval fantasy aesthetic. Noble houses clash, the church maneuvers from the shadows, personal loyalties fracture under the weight of ambition, and underneath it all is a sobering yet hopeful message. History is often written by the victor, but the righteous always endure, even if their names are erased from history. It's a tremendous accomplishment for a game that was never intended to be a mainline entry, and with the recent release of the Evil East Chronicles version on all platforms, there is no better time to experience this masterpiece than now. Number 10. The Legacy of Kain, Soul Reaver 2. There are few hills that I'm willing to die on when it comes to gaming. but one of them is that dialogue in video games peaked with the Legacy of Kain franchise. Though all 5 of the primary games in the franchise tower above the competition in this regard, I firmly believe that the quality of the dialogue finds its greatest expression in Soul Reaver 2. Continuing the themes established in Blood Omen and Soul Reaver 1, Soul Reaver 2 is the most thorough and philosophical meditation on the concept of free will. The character of Raziel begins as the pawn of eldritch forces. He believes he is fulfilling his destiny. By contrast, Kain is the one trying to break the wheel of fate. He sees the concept of destiny as a prison and is searching for an escape, even if it comes at too great a cost. The entire game becomes a duel between these two positions, and while there are moments of epic vampiric action and violence, most of the drama takes place in long verbal exchanges, conversations that transcend mere video game cutscenes and feel like theater. I was just comparing Final Fantasy Tactics to Shakespeare, but the dialogue in this game, matched with the performances of Michael Bell and Simon Templeman as Raziel and Kain, give the dialogue a gravitas that few works of fiction ever matched. Every time these two converse, it doesn't feel like a mere philosophical discussion. Every sentence feels like a measured strike in a larger metaphysical duel. One where a word misspoken could result in the fabric of existence tearing itself apart. It is the closest that gaming has ever come to classical tragedy, and the only thing more tragic is that we never got a conclusion to this amazing story. Number 9. BioShock. The only other time I cared to learn about Ayn Rand's objectivist philosophy was after I listened to the album Anthem by Rush, greatest band in Canadian history. Outside of that, BioShock did an equally, if not superior, job. At a glance, the game appears to be a straightforward critique of objectivism. Andrew Ryan's underwater city of Rapture is built on the belief that the great should not be constrained by the weak, that free markets and individual strength, when left unchecked, will produce greatness. Though the mere existence of Rapture is evidence in favor of this conclusion, the underwater civilization nonetheless collapses, because freedom without moral restraint corrodes into exploitation of the weak. This leads to a utopian socialist rebellion that, much like Andrew Ryan's philosophy, is grounded in some truths, but also has fatal flaws. Where most other games would advocate replacing one dogma with another, BioShock examines both sides in an honest, rigorous, and accessible way. But BioShock's most subversive critique is not aimed solely at political ideology. It is aimed at the illusion of choice. Throughout the game, you act believing that the choices you're making are your own. But then, in one of the most famous moments in video game history, BioShock forces you to confront your limitations, and in doing so, the game transforms into a meta-commentary on video games as a whole, challenging the assumption that players are ever truly in control. Number 8. Deus Ex. The story of Deus Ex framed the course of the 21st century before the 21st century began. All the way back in the year 2000 when the game released, it was talking about how things like terrorism and pandemics would be used to erode civil liberties, how the internet would exacerbate the spread of misinformation, and how society would become increasingly reliant on artificial intelligence. That was long before events like 9/11, COVID, the widespread adoption of social media, and AI language models. That's how prescient Deus Ex is. But instead of just being an inadvertent soapbox to preach the apocalypse, Deus Ex chooses to not present these ideas through in-your-face cutscenes. Instead, you have to seek out most of them for yourself. Deus Ex was one of the pioneers of the immersive simulator genre of gaming, where the player can choose to interact with the world or approach a mission in whichever style they want. This isn't just limited to the gameplay, but includes much of the story as well. Some of the most profound moments in video game history can be completely missed if you don't seek out every NPC and every plot thread that you can, and I wouldn't have it any other way. By empowering the gamer to not just play the game as a mindless shooter, Deus Ex conditions you to question authority, verify information, and think twice before pulling the trigger. Few works of fiction understood the trajectory of our society so accurately, and fewer still trusted their audience to confront it. Number 7. Metal Gear Solid 2: Sons of Liberty. If any of you doubted my attempts to be unbiased with this list, Metal Gear Solid 2 is my all-time favorite video game, and yet I still put 6 games above it. What can I say that I and millions of others haven't already said about MGS2? Not only does it have the most profound moment in gaming history, a registered trademark of Maxdera Corporation, all rights reserved, the game is the greatest argument for postmodernism as an artistic ethos. By that, I mean that the whole point of Metal Gear Solid 2 was to deconstruct everything about Metal Gear Solid 1. You have to understand that at the time, Metal Gear Solid 2 was probably the most anticipated video game in history. The sequel could have easily been just another entry with better graphics and combat, but instead, the creator of the franchise, Hideo Kojima, wanted to use the game as one big meta-commentary. Though the game begins like a traditional sequel, it slowly reveals itself to be a mirror, not just reflecting the characters on the screen, but the player holding the controller. It interrogates our appetite for violence, our loyalty to narratives, and our susceptibility to misinformation in the digital age. More than 2 decades later, Metal Gear Solid 2 remains one of the most daring, artistic risks that the medium has ever taken for its commentary on these matters. And today, it feels more relevant than ever. Number 6. Fallout New Vegas. One of the greatest ongoing debates in the history of gaming is who deserves to control the Mojave Wasteland. Every faction that offers to do so comes with a compelling argument and a fatal flaw. Whether it's the bureaucratic familiarity of the New California Republic, the Hegelian dialectics and ruthlessness of Caesar's Legion, the enlightened autocracy of Mr. House, or radical independence, Fallout New Vegas never offers a clear choice, and that is what has kept it endlessly fascinating for almost 2 decades. What elevates this debate is the dialogue system itself. It has an intricacy and quality that the majority of RPGs since then just never seem to match. Your intelligence, speech, and reputation result in a variety of organic exchanges, as though you're speaking to real people wrestling with real beliefs, rather than just clicking through NPC text boxes. And then there's the characters themselves. Figures like Randall Clark, who you never meet, but whose tragic backstory is beautifully told through scattered journal entries. Or Joshua Graham, a religious man that was so well written that thousands of Fallout fans credit him with sending them back to church. Nobody feels like a caricature. Everybody represents a worldview with both dignity and danger, and that's what makes New Vegas so enduring. It doesn't ask you who is right, it asks you who is the least wrong. And even after you make your choice, the game never fully assures you that you chose wisely. Number 5. Planescape Torment. For my money, the greatest writer in the history of the video game medium is Chris Avellone. He is responsible for much of the dialogue in games like Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic 2, Pillars of Eternity, and almost all of the DLC in the aforementioned Fallout New Vegas. But easily, in my opinion, his masterpiece is Planescape Torment. The story of this game was written as both an embrace of the world of Dungeons & Dragons, as well as a critique of its traditional conventions. Instead of a story centered around saving the world while fighting dragons and finding the best gear, Planescape centers on a character known as the Nameless One, an immortal who recently lost all of his memory. On his journey, he comes into contact with a variety of characters and factions, each embodying a distinct philosophical and/or religious worldview. The quests these characters give and the decisions made within not only lead to inner conflicts within the Nameless One, but the gamer as well. I am not exaggerating when I say that I learned more about philosophy and its history by playing Planescape than I did in a single philosophy class in school. Due to this, you feel your ethics and sense of identity evolve the more you play this game. By the time the ending unfolds, the game forces both the Nameless One and, by proxy, the player to answer its central question: what can change the nature of a man? And the answer you choose won't just define the character, it will define you forever. Number 4. Outer Wilds. If there is a single game that proves video games are uniquely capable of telling stories no other medium can, that game is Outer Wilds. Within the game's opening moments, you understand a few things very quickly. The game gives you a whole solar system to explore, but you only have 22 minutes to explore it before the sun goes supernova and destroys everything. Thankfully though, for some mysterious reason, you're able to be reborn and repeat this loop ad infinitum. Within these 22-minute loops, the player must follow story threads to the various planets in order to piece together the history of the solar system, as well as the civilizations that live or lived there, and hopefully understand why you are unable to die. The game puts ultimate trust in the player to not only be able to piece the story together, but also to handle the truths that are revealed. While the game begins as a playful exploration, it slowly transforms into something terrifying. It becomes a literal confrontation with the scale of the cosmos and the inevitability of fate. The game will provoke a sense of deep existential horror within you, but it is matched with an equal sense of beauty. Outside of the previously mentioned Lost Odyssey, few works of art have taught me to be at peace with the way the universe is, to accept impermanence, and in doing so, I understood that all endings, even the annihilation of the universe, are simply part of the eternal story, and I could learn to accept it all with gratitude. Number 3. Silent Hill 2. I said before that Spec-Ops The Line might be responsible for more analysis than any other game, but if there was a serious contender for that title, it would be Silent Hill 2. The power of this game has endured for 2.5 decades because it is structured in a way that invites endless interpretation. Every image, character, and location feels like it's pointing to something deeper, and the deeper you look, the more the game seems to look back at you. Through this, the game weaves an everlasting spell over the gamer that never quite lets go. Though there is an ever-present fog of symbolism and subjectivity that can be interpreted forever, there is a canonical story that lies underneath. A story about guilt, grief, and the lengths that the human mind will go to avoid confronting the darkness of one's soul. While the story draws from hundreds of familiar classics like Crime and Punishment, The Shining, and Twin Peaks, Silent Hill 2 never feels like an homage. It feels like an authentic, once-in-a-generation work of art. A chaotic mishmash of so many different influences and styles that could only exist in a nightmare. And yet, it's a nightmare you can play. And when the nightmare finally gives way to clarity, we realize that the most horrifying thing is not just what stalks us in the dark, but what we are capable of doing, and in the worst case, forgetting. That message is what makes Silent Hill 2 the most psychologically devastating story that the medium has ever produced. Number 2. Xenogears. No game has ever aimed higher than Xenogears, both in its scale and its depth. It is not content with just telling a story about war, or religion, or psychology, or politics, but telling all of them at once, while also planning it as one part in a 5-part series. Xenogears was so ambitious in this regard that it actually ended up unfinished. The infamous second disc had to cut a number of cutscenes and replace them in favor of narration because the scope for this PlayStation 1 game was so huge. Nonetheless, in its unfinished state, Xenogears somehow feels immaculate. Its story spans thousands of years, covering subjects like the nature of God, the nature of consciousness, reincarnation, trauma, free will, all while continuously keeping the focus on a single character named Faye, a fractured young man who is trying to regain his memories and build a new identity. What is most impressive to me, however, is that it doesn't dilute the sophistication of its ideas and the traditions it draws from. From psychoanalysis to German existentialism and esoteric religious traditions, Xenogears paints a symbolic picture with all of them, and the result is something that feels less like a video game and more like a philosophical epic. Like something that will be taught in schools alongside classical literature one day, because no other game has treated its audience with this much intellectual respect. It refused to shrink its ideas to fit the medium, and in doing so, it showed what the medium is truly capable of. Number 1. Nier Automata. Nier Automata earns the number 1 spot because it feels complete in a way that no other game does. It takes the qualities that made every other entry on this list exceptional, and then synthesizes them without diminishing them. It takes the ambition of Xenogears, the interactivity of Outer Wilds, the meta-commentary of Metal Gear Solid 2, the existential dread of SOMA, and unites them all into a perfect balance. It is idiosyncratic without being pretentious, hilarious one moment and devastating the next, philosophically dense without ever losing sight of the fact that it is a video game, and it weaponizes that fact to say something that no other medium could. Beneath the cute machines and androids learning to love, there is a question that has haunted Western philosophy for the last 2 centuries. What do we do in a world that God seems to have abandoned? In the wake of the German existentialist Friedrich Nietzsche's proclamation of the death of God, humanity is left without a system of meaning to ground their suffering in. In its absence, one must provide their own meaning. But Nier Automata makes it quite clear how difficult and often fruitless this process is. It references several real-life philosophers and the answers they tried to give to Nietzsche's conundrum, while subtly demonstrating why their existential antidotes might be flawed. Through these repeated failures, Nier Automata is unrelenting in how absurd, cruel, and randomly tragic life can be. But instead of collapsing into pessimism and despair, the game argues through its narrative, its gameplay, and its endings that you can choose meaning. Most importantly, it asks what you, the gamer, are willing to sacrifice in service of its meaning. And through this, Nier Automata shows what the medium is capable of at its absolute highest level. As I said at the beginning, this is just my list, and it's the one I came up with at this present moment. I'm sure that as I play more games over the years, the ranking will shift. And of course, because there are thousands of games, I am bound to have missed at least 1 or 2 that are on your list that should have been on mine. Let me know what you thought of my list and what your top games are in the comments section below. Remember, it's all subjective and all in good fun, so please, be civil down there. Until next time, remember to stay safe and stay yellow.